The lady that single-handedly invented the modern sitcom is Lucille Ball, and the show she started with was I Love Lucy. It broke ground and laid the pathway that all sitcoms followed for years afterwards. A lot of people compare her with the Beatles, except she was on TV. Her iconic series that ran from 1951 to 1957 made her the person that ruled Hollywood during that time. She ended up remaining on top of the small screen during the 60s and 70s as well. Her next show was The Lucy Show, and it was just as hilarious with all its physical humor as her original show. But probably the most overlooked of her series was Here's Lucy, which aired from 1968 to 1974. And it was set completely across the country in California. It in some ways is a continuation of The Lucy Show because there's a regular cast of characters like Gail Gordon and Mary Jane Croft that came along for the ride to California. The show came about because of a business transaction. This lady was smart. Not only was she a great actor, she was a superb business lady. In 1968, The Lucy Show had been running for 6 seasons, and the ratings were still really solid. Lucille Ball had sold the Desilu studio that she owned that year. So in order to retain her ownership of her series, she ceased production of The Lucy Show and created this show. This new series had a slightly different plot and new character names, plus roles from Lucy's kids, but continued with the same cast basically and the same time slot. One of the big things about this show is that it allowed Lucy to work with her children, Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr. She had always had a deep desire to do this. They played Kim Carter and Craig Carter, the teenage kids of Lucy Carter, who worked in L.A. at Carter's Unique Employment Agency. It's kind of interesting that all of her shows kind of had a magic number of 6. I Love Lucy, The Lucy Show, lasted for 6 seasons, just like Here's Lucy did. Here's Lucy was the #1 show on CBS in 1970 to 71. This season was noted for a sea of change in programming as younger and more hip shows swept in to replace original rural comedies. But the legend of Lucille Ball couldn't be pitched out like these other shows. Here's Lucy was the top show for its network that year and was the #3 show overall for television in general. Her sitcoms had spent more than 2 decades in the top 10 of the ratings. That's just an amazing run. In 1973, Here's Lucy slipped to number 15, which still made it a huge hit. In its final season, it dropped to number 29, drawing about the same numbers as The Carol Burnett Show and Kung Fu. Desi Arnaz Jr., her son, ended up bailing on the sitcom in 1971. This was following its biggest year. He really wanted to do this to become a film star. He landed a couple of big roles pretty quickly, playing Marco Polo in Marco and the title role in Billy Two Hats, starring alongside Gregory Peck. Now, he had already achieved a lot of fame as a pop singer in the 1960s, as he starred in a rock band called Dino, Desi, and Billy, and they had scored a couple of top 40 hits. And they also toured with the Beach Boys. It doesn't get much better than that. Now, the season 4 finale was actually a backdoor pilot for Lucy Arnaz herself. This was set up as a spin-off show. Lucille Ball took this opportunity to help her daughter with her own show, called The Lucy Arnaz Show. Now, the act of her leaving the show left a terrible void in the sitcom. And to counter this, her plan was to bring in VIVIAN Vance, her old co-star from The Lucy Show, in an episode called With Viv as a Friend, Who Needs an Enemy? This brought together the popular duo from the I Love Lucy show and the Lucy show, but this would be terribly bittersweet. The plans for the show was to bring her on full time to fill the void left by her kids leaving. Shortly after she filmed this episode with Lucy, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that episode would be the final time that the two starred together in a sitcom. They did get together at one other occasion during a 1977 TV special called Lucy Calls the President. There were plans to wrap the series up at the end of the 5th season, but the head of CBS later convinced Lucille Ball not to throw in the towel. It's funny how the season ends with Lucy hanging an out-of-business sign on her door of the office. Then at the very top of it, she tacks on temporarily out of business and gives a wink to the audience. Now, Lucy loved Desi Arnaz, her husband, but she just couldn't live with him. But she never forgot what the duo did together in Hollywood. And to pay homage to him, she did a unique thing with her characters in her sitcoms with their names. Lucy Ricardo, Lucy Carmichael, Lucy Carter. There's a reason for all those AR names. She was paying tribute to her former husband and partner, Desi Arnaz, the first 2 letters of the last name. Before the start of the 5th season, Lucille Ball fractured her leg in a skiing mishap. This injury was worked into the plot as the actress spent much of her season in a cast. The problem with that cut down a lot of the slapstick comedy that she was always known for. She would never be quite the same physically on screen again. Lucille Ball actually guest stars as herself in an episode. This is far more bizarre than having her real kids appearing in the series. In the 6th season episode, Lucy Carter meets Lucille Ball. Her Carter character enters a Ball look-alike contest, and naturally she wins it. She wore a darker brown hair color as herself in this episode to help differentiate the characters. And she actually stands on screen next to herself thanks to the magic of television. This sitcom roped in dozens of big guest stars. Everyone from Johnny Carson to Wayne Newton. Even the guest stars had guest stars. In the 2nd episode, Lucy visits Jack Benny. Benny, who is in real life Lucille Ball's real next-door neighbor, holds a backyard barbecue. At the end, he invites his bus driver friend to come over and eat a hamburger. Who walks in but the most famous bus driver of all, Ralph Cramden. Jackie Gleason reprised his honeymooner's character in full costume. He also ends up putting a dollar bill on his hamburger and proclaims how sweet it is. In the opening of the show, Lucille Ball is seen winking to someone off screen. It was originally intended for her to wink at the stop-motion Lucy. However, they just couldn't fit both of these into the same shot. It kind of still gives the impression that she's winking at herself or the stop-motion doll off screen. The show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which was in competition with the Lucy show, made fun of their competition with it frequently by having the cast say goodnight and goodbye to Lucy at the end of the show. Lucy responded by being irritated and asked if they thought they were funny in doing this. But Lucille Ball got the last laugh, though. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was canceled in 1973, 1 year before this show was canceled, so she outlived them. This series was largely forgotten in the late 80s and early 90s, and was rarely seen on cable networks during that time. Now you can find it on Amazon Prime, and it's free to watch. It's always a blast to see Lucy in action. There's never a dull moment with her. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.